January 14th, 1942, 0145 hours, 60 miles southeast of Montauk Point, Long Island. Kapitan Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan peered through U-123's periscope at a sight that seemed almost impossible. A 9,500-ton Norwegian tanker, fully illuminated, burning navigation lamps as if peacetime still existed. The SS Norness steamed southward, completely unaware that a German submarine had crossed the Atlantic to hunt American coastal waters. Hardigan couldn't believe his luck. Cities along the American coast blazed with lights. New York's skyline was visible from 40 miles at sea. Beach resorts kept their neon signs lit. Lighthouses swept their beams across the ocean. Ships sailed independently, no escorts, no convoys, broadcasting their positions with running lights like they were on a Sunday cruise. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat force, had calculated what it would take to strangle the British economy and win the war at sea. When America entered the war on December 11, 1941, he saw a golden opportunity. Hitler ordered an assault on America on December 12, 1941. Dönitz gave the operation a simple but eloquent name: Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. Hardigan gave the order: torpedo los! The Norness exploded in a pillar of flame visible from shore. 22 of her 35-man crew died in the initial blast or drowned in burning oil. It was the first ship sunk in what would become the most catastrophic naval defeat in American history. A 6-month slaughter that would kill more Americans than Pearl Harbor and bring Britain closer to starvation than at any point in either World War. And American naval commanders had been warned. They knew the U-boats were coming. They had the intelligence. They had the ships to stop them. They did nothing.
On January 12, 1942, Admiral Andrews was warned that 3 or 4 U-boats were about to commence operations against coastal shipping. British intelligence had been tracking U-boat movements from France. They'd broken German naval codes. They knew exactly where the submarines were heading and approximately when they'd arrive. The classified alert message from U.S. Navy headquarters flashed out to all Atlantic Fleet commands shortly before 1300 hours on Tuesday, January 13, 1942. Info received indicates large concentration proceeding to or already arrived on station off Canadian and northeastern U.S. coasts X 3 or 4 U-boats near 40 N-065W. Admiral Adolphus Andrews commanded the eastern sea frontier, the naval district responsible for protecting America's Atlantic coast from Canada to Florida. He received the warning with barely concealed contempt. Andrews refused to institute a convoy system on the grounds that this would only provide the U-boats with more targets. Read that again. The commander responsible for protecting American shipping refused to implement the one defensive measure that had proven effective against submarines for 25 years because he believed, without evidence, without logic, that convoys made better targets than independent ships. The British were stunned. They'd spent 2 years fighting U-boats in the North Atlantic. They'd learned through catastrophic losses that convoys worked. Individual ships were helpless. Escorted convoys survived. The lesson had been written in thousands of sailors' lives. American commanders dismissed British advice as cowardice. "The Royal Navy is incompetent," one senior American officer reportedly said. "They let the Germans push them around. We won't make their mistakes." The arrogance was breathtaking, and it was about to be punished with shocking brutality.
Only 6 of the 20 operational Type 9 boats were available for Operation Drumbeat, and one of those 6 encountered mechanical trouble. This left just 5 long-range submarines for the opening moves of the campaign. 5 submarines. That's all Dönitz could send to attack the entire American East Coast. The standard Type 7 U-boat had insufficient range to patrol off the coast of North America. Only the larger, slower Type 9 boats could make the crossing.
5 submarines against the entire Atlantic seaboard of the United States. But those 5 submarines had something American commanders didn't understand. Dönitz had revived Hermann Bauer's idea of grouping several submarines together into a Rudel tactic, pack tactic, commonly called a wolfpack, to overwhelm a merchant convoy's escorts. The wolfpack doctrine had evolved through brutal trial and error. In October 1918, Karl Dönitz himself had been captured when his U-boat was sunk during a coordinated attack attempt in the Mediterranean. He'd spent years as a prisoner of war thinking about what went wrong. When Germany began rebuilding its submarine force in 1935, Dönitz was appointed to command it specifically because of his obsession with coordinated submarine tactics. U-boats usually patrolled separately, often strung out in lines across likely convoy routes, being ordered to congregate only after one located a convoy and alerted the BDU, U-boat command. The strategy was elegant. Spread submarines across shipping lanes. When one found a convoy, it would shadow the target and broadcast its position. Headquarters would vector every available submarine toward the contact. Then, under cover of darkness, the entire pack would attack simultaneously. Rudel tactic consisted of as many U-boats as could reach the scene of the attack. With the exception of orders given by the BDU, U-boat commanders could attack as they saw fit. But off the American coast in January 1942, wolfpack tactics weren't even necessary. The 5 U-boats operated independently because there were so many targets that coordination was pointless. It wasn't hunting, it was a massacre.
When U-123 sank the 9,500-ton Norwegian tanker Norness within sight of Long Island in the early hours of January 14, no warships were dispatched to investigate. At this time, there were 13 destroyers idle in New York Harbor, yet none were employed to deal with the immediate threat. 13 destroyers sitting in port, while a German submarine hunted American waters. U-123 sank the 6,700-ton British tanker Coimbra off Sandy Hook the following night before proceeding south toward New Jersey. Over the following nights, U-123 was presented with a succession of easy targets, most of them burning navigation lamps. German U-boat commanders couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was later stated in a report of the German Kriegsmarine that the ships were made completely visible by the lights coming from the coast, which made them sitting ducks. The American refusal to implement coastal blackouts was criminally negligent. New York, Atlantic City, Miami, every coastal city kept its lights blazing. Ships passing offshore were silhouetted perfectly against the glow. U-boat commanders didn't need to search. They just positioned themselves between the coast and the shipping lanes and waited for targets to appear as black shapes against the luminous horizon. The following night, Zapp deliberately sank the 7,988-ton Canadian passenger cargo ship Lady Hawkins. A total of 162 of the ship's 212 passengers and 88 of her 109 crewmen were lost, sending Drumbeat's death toll to over 400. 400 dead in less than a week, and the carnage was just beginning. German submariners named it the Happy Time or the Golden Time, as defense measures were weak and disorganized, and U-boats were able to inflict massive damage with little risk. They called it the American shooting season. Some U-boat commanders joked that it was easier than peacetime training exercises. Targets were more plentiful and better illuminated than in any practice scenario they'd ever conducted.
Andrews had practically no modern forces to work with. On the water, he commanded 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 1919 vintage patrol boats, 2 gunboats dating back to 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers. About 100 aircraft were available, but these were short-range models only suitable for training. This was the excuse. America lacked resources. The Navy was stretched thin. The Pacific demanded priority after Pearl Harbor.
There weren't enough ships or planes to protect the East Coast. All lies. Or rather, all technically true but fundamentally dishonest. Yes, Andrews lacked dedicated anti-submarine forces, but the real problem wasn't resources, it was doctrine. Admiral Ernest J. King commanded the Atlantic Fleet. King was brilliant, abrasive, and catastrophically stubborn. He despised the British and refused to learn from their experience. When British Admiral Percy Noble offered to send anti-submarine warfare instructors to teach American crews, King declined. When the British offered to send escort groups to help protect American shipping, King refused. American pride would not accept British help. American exceptionalism insisted that U.S. forces would develop their own solutions, not copy foreign methods. The result was predictable. In March 1942, the Navy's Board on the Organization of East Coast Convoys concluded that poorly escorted convoys were too dangerous. They simply assembled targets for the enemy. It was better to keep those targets dispersed. This defied every lesson learned in 2 years of Atlantic warfare. The British could have told them, poorly escorted convoys are better than no convoys. Dispersed ships are helpful.
As more U-boats arrived off the American coast through February and March 1942, Dönitz began implementing full wolfpack tactics against the few convoys that were eventually organized. A single pack was built, officially, around about 15 U-boats. In practice, numbers varied for reasons such as battle losses, repairs, and training of new crews. But in principle, the discovery of a large convoy was meant to initiate a process that gathered upwards of 15 U-boats into a single location, where they would simultaneously attack. The tactics were devastatingly effective. By 1939, Dönitz's doctrine crystallized into 5 principles. 1. Concentrated patrol lines, U-boats deployed in staggered groups across shipping lanes. 2. Radio coordination. Central command directed wolfpacks via encrypted signals. 3. Overwhelming numbers. Multiple U-boats converging on single convoys. 4. Surface speed. Attacking at night, exploiting submarines' faster surface mobility. 5. Relentless pursuit. Continuous harassment until the convoy was annihilated. The key insight was that submarines were faster on the surface than submerged. Early sonar, ASDIC, could only detect submerged submarines. A U-boat running on the surface at night was invisible to sonar and nearly invisible visually. It could race ahead of a convoy, position itself, attack, then accelerate away before escorts could respond. As Allied convoying evolved during the war and more merchants were obliged to sail in large groups for safety, the potential for an individual U-boat to visually sight a target decreased. To increase the chances of detecting a convoy, wolfpacks formed patrol lines that bisected the Great Circle routes. The distance between each U-boat in a patrol line was set so a convoy could not pass through the line undetected. Once contact was made, the first U-boat became the shadower, remaining at periscope depth during daylight, surfacing at night to maintain contact, broadcasting regular position reports. Headquarters would calculate intercept courses for every U-boat within range and issue movement orders. Then came the night attack. Multiple U-boats, converging from different angles, hitting the convoy simultaneously. Escorts couldn't defend against threats from multiple directions. While they chased one submarine, 3 others were torpedoing undefended merchant ships. It was coordinated warfare at sea on a scale never before attempted. And it worked, with terrifying efficiency.
This powerful retort, soon reinforced by the second round of Drumbeat, finally made an impression on King and Edwards. In May, they began taking steps to darken coastal cities, learn the subtracking business, and install deck artillery manned by well-trained Navy personnel aboard cargo ships. But it was too little, too late. The search for Allied tankers and support from U-459, a Type 14 submarine tender, pushed the U-boat offensive into the Gulf of Mexico.
On April 21, U-459 was 600 miles northwest of Bermuda. It refueled 14 U-boats through May 6, including Type 7s, headed for the Gulf and the Caribbean. The Type 14 milch cow submarines were a stroke of genius. These 1,700-ton submarines carried no torpedoes, only fuel, food, spare parts, and torpedoes for resupply. The arrival of Dönitz's milch cow submarine tenders lengthened U-boat operations. Now even the shorter-range Type 7 U-boats and operate off the American coast, doubling or tripling the number of submarines hunting American waters. In May, they sank 115 ships, of which 101 were steaming independently, about half being in the Gulf, with half of that tonnage being tankers. In June, they sank 122 ships, of which 108 were sailing independently. May and June 1942 were the worst months. By May, U-boat strength in American waters peaked at 19 submarines. That's all it took to bring American coastal shipping to its knees. In May 1942, U-boats finally arrived in the Gulf of Mexico in strength, where little had been done to protect shipping. In that month alone, U-boats sank 115 ships in the Atlantic, nearly half of these in the Gulf of Mexico. Of the 23 U-boats operating in the Gulf, only one was lost. 23 U-boats, one lost, against the industrial might of the United States. The human cost was staggering. 18 of Hitler's U-boats sank nearly 500 Allied freighters and tankers along the U.S. Atlantic coast, killing around 5,000 merchant seamen and U.S. Navy sailors. In the first 8 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400.
The statistics don't capture the horror. Jackson went down with 22 of her 35-man crew. Men drowned in freezing water. They burned alive in flaming oil slicks. They floated for days in lifeboats, watching for rescue that often never came. The crew of the tanker Benjamin Brewster was not so lucky. A U-boat sank it just 2.5 miles from Grand Isle, Louisiana, and 25 crewmen were killed. Some of the others survived by rowing their lifeboats to the Grand Isle beach. Survivors told of seeing U-boats surface, of watching through binoculars as German submariners stood on deck, smoking cigarettes, waving at people on shore. Some reported U-boats shelling ships with deck guns at point-blank range, the German crews seeming almost bored by the lack of resistance. Rumors swirled in Alabama of German submariners coming ashore at night to visit American women. Whether true or not, the rumors themselves indicated how completely German submarines dominated American coastal waters. Citizens believed U-boat crews were so confident they could literally take shore leave in enemy territory. Merchant mariners developed a fatalistic gallows humor. They called tanker duty sailing in a ronson after the cigarette lighter, because ships lit the first time, every time. The casualty rates for tanker crews exceeded those of any military service except submarine duty itself. And still, American commanders refused to implement proper convoy systems.
The first organized U.S. coastal convoy sailed on May 14, 1942, from Hampton Roads for Key West, 5 months after the U-boat offensive began. 5 months of slaughter. 5 months of British pleading, of merchant mariners dying, of oil slicks washing up on American beaches. Finally, Admiral King relented. Partially. The British sent help in May. 2 mid-ocean escort groups redeployed to the Caribbean to defend British convoys, and several trawlers went to the American East Coast. This modest increment in escort strength may have been all the U.S. Navy needed. In mid-May, the first American convoys in the eastern sea frontier began operating between Key West, Florida, and Hampton Roads, Virginia. The effect was immediate. Once ships began sailing in convoy with even minimal escorts, losses plummeted. U-boats couldn't attack convoys with the same impunity they'd enjoyed against independent ships. Escorts forced submarines to submerge, losing their speed advantage. Coordinated attacks became dangerous. Multiple U-boats converging on an escorted convoy meant multiple escorts hunting them. From mid-May 1942, the RCN established escorted convoy routes between Halifax and Boston, and between St. John, New Brunswick, and Halifax. The Canadians, who had been fighting U-boats for 2 years, implemented what the Americans had resisted: comprehensive convoy systems with interlocking coverage. By August 1942, the second happy time was over. Realizing that happy time in the Western Hemisphere was over, Dönitz started shifting his U-boats back to the North Atlantic for a renewed blitz on Allied convoys. The wolves moved on to easier hunting grounds, but they would return.
By March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its climax. U-boats sank 120 merchant ships, nearly 700,000 tons, with only 15 submarine losses that month. Moreover, U-boats sank nearly 2/3 of the ships, 500,000 tons, while they were in convoy. Convoy, the bedrock of Allied maritime war strategy, was in question. The British Admiralty noted that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communication between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. The wolfpacks were winning. Dönitz had finally achieved the force concentration he'd calculated in 1935 was necessary to strangle Britain. Enough U-boats operating simultaneously to sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. If the trend continued for another 6 months, Britain would face starvation and fuel exhaustion. The war would be lost. But just 8 weeks later, on May 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, Operation Drumbeat was a coup for Dönitz's Grey Wolves and an appalling episode for the Allies. During the first half of 1942, in coastal waters from Canada to the Caribbean, more than 360 merchant ships and tankers, totaling about 2,200,000 tons, were sunk. 2.2 million tons of shipping in 6 months off American shores. Hardigan's share was 9 ships, totaling 50,766 tons. Admiral Dönitz was pleased and signaled U-123 to the drumbeater Hardigan, "Bravo, you beat the drum well." Hardigan was awarded the coveted Knight's Cross. But the strategic calculation tells a different story. By 1945, 793 U-boats had been lost, taking 30,000 crewmen. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, 28,000 never came home. A 72% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during the war. The U-boat campaign sank 3,500 vessels, totaling 14 million tons. An enormous toll, but it wasn't enough. Allied shipyards, particularly American shipyards, using mass production techniques, built ships faster than U-boats could sink them. By 1943, the Liberty ship program was launching 2 ships per day, every day. The wolfpacks had inflicted terrible damage. They'd brought Britain to the brink of collapse, but they couldn't sustain the offensive against industrial powers that outproduced Germany 50-1 in ships, aircraft, and munitions. While the U-boat campaign tied down vast Allied resources, Germany's inability to match industrial output doomed it.
The second happy time, Operation Drumbeat and its aftermath, taught lessons that resonate today. Arrogance kills. American commanders' refusal to learn from British experience directly caused thousands of unnecessary deaths. National pride is not a substitute for competence. Doctrine matters more than technology. U-boats weren't technologically superior to Allied anti-submarine systems, but German tactical doctrine, wolfpack coordination, initially overwhelmed Allied defenses. When Allied doctrine adapted, the same technology that had failed before became decisive. Logistics wins wars. Germany built excellent submarines and trained superb crews, but they couldn't build enough submarines or train enough crews to overcome Allied industrial capacity. Intelligence is decisive.
Breaking German codes, detecting radio transmissions, tracking U-boat movements, intelligence allowed Allies to route convoys around submarine patrol lines and later to deliberately engage and destroy wolfpacks. Adaptation determines survival. The side that learns faster wins. Germany's initial tactical advantage lasted barely 2 years before Allied countermeasures neutralized it. But perhaps the most important lesson was forgotten even as it was being learned. Mocking your enemy's strategy while refusing to adapt your own is a recipe for disaster. American commanders in January 1942 dismissed wolfpack tactics as desperate gambits by a losing enemy. They mocked German submarine strategy. They refused British advice. They insisted American methods would prove superior. Then U-boats sank 400 ships in 6 months and killed 5,000 Americans off their own coastline. The submarines didn't sink the Atlantic Fleet. The title is rhetorical exaggeration, but they came terrifyingly close to cutting Britain's lifeline and possibly forcing an Allied defeat in Europe. And it happened because American commanders were too arrogant to listen, too stubborn to learn, and too proud to implement tactics that had already proven successful. The Grey Wolves of Admiral Dönitz's U-boat force taught that lesson in blood and fire, in burning tankers and drowning men, in oil-slicked beaches and widows' telegrams. By the time American commanders stopped mocking and started learning, thousands were already dead. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and the Second Happy Time had earned its horrifying nickname. Not for the Americans who died, but for the German submariners who hunted them almost unopposed for half a year. The Wolves eventually lost. But before they did, they proved that strategic arrogance is more dangerous than any weapon system. That lesson remains relevant wherever commanders face unfamiliar threats from adaptive enemies.